Reflections on the Problem of Love by Andreas Salome. Originally published in 1900 in the New German Review. Andreas Salome, born 1861, died 1937, emerges in the restless intellectual landscape of Central Europe at the turn of the century as a figure that is both singular and representative of a broad state of spirit. Singular because she embodies the voice and the feminine thoughts in a philosophical and artistic medium dominated by men since time immemorial. And representative because she takes on and summarizes in her life and in her work the cultural concerns that were transforming in a way decisive the intellectual horizon of the Europeans in those crucial years. Her personal relationship, sometimes tumultuous with figures like Nietzsche, Rilke, and Freud, have contributed to creating the image of Andreas Salome as a muse, inspiring those men of genius. And while that is so, she also has her own voice, as clear as that of her illustrious friends, whose thoughts she assimilates perfectly and puts at the service of her own investigation into the female condition, thereby making a very valuable contribution to the overall process of reconsideration of cultural values in which the European intellectuality of its time was immersed. And so we begin. Within the emotional relationships of man with the world around him, including people and things, at first glance it seems that everything can be categorized into two large groups. On one side, what is homogeneous, pleasant, familiar to us. And on the other side, what we find unknown, strange, and even hostile. Our natural selfishness feels spontaneously moved to expand, to delve in, sharing pain or joy in the other's self, as if it were one's own self, or, by the opposite, to withdraw, to avoid the outside world in a gesture of hostility or threat. The type of this egoism is, in the strict sense of the word, the firm individual will that loves only oneself, same as it obeys itself, subordinating everything else to its own purposes. The type of selfishness open of what is called altruism is the nature of the Samaritan with his ideal of brotherhood, universal, that in anyone, even in the most remote being, recognizes and feels the great total unity. Both trends are sharpened relentlessly and inexorably during the course of progress of humanity, so that the conflict to which both are prone emerges to the surface, giving thus their peculiar imprint on each era of culture. We cannot give them a definitive reconciliation. One of both trends aims to abruptly establish itself as the exclusive norm, with all fairness and authority, when the opposing one requires a strong correction due to a previous exaggeration. Every living person participates to a greater or lesser degree in both, and their full commitment to one should put him in a situation of extreme danger. Unmeasured altruism needs a brake on it. Self-love, in order to draw from his own and secure individual reserve of goods, and the most hardened and accomplished egoist must renounce in his solitude hundreds of possibilities of happiness and wealth that cannot be achieved as a result of plunder, but are only given to those who open themselves to them. It will be difficult in real life to accurately appreciate and distinguish case by case the limits between weakness and goodness, between rigor and power. And there will be more opinions and theories than there is sand in the sea about how goodness and power should be balanced in man. And that topic becomes interesting even from a psychological perspective, since man cannot enter either of the two enclosures without self-mutilation. And even both tendencies, despite their apparent contradiction, can ultimately unite at some point, achieving a deep understanding, as if beneath both a basic longing that constantly branches out into the variety of its trends, without reaching, therefore, to the quieting. The individual's longing to achieve the totality of life that he surrounds, to enter into it, to feel fulfilled. The selfish one who hoards and struggles to assimilate as much as possible for himself, and also the altruistic who dedicates themselves participating in everything they can. They are whispering, each one in their own language, a sentence that, at its core, is the same prayer to the same God, and in that prayer is confused in one single thing, self-love with self-denial. And so the I want to have it all and the I want to be everything recovers a single ultimate meaning, that of yearning desire. But none of them achieves it, the sought after, for there lies a contradiction. The selfish should be non-selfish, and at the same time be himself, while the non-selfish should be selfish and be himself at the same time, in order to learn to rise above beyond the very limits of their being. Our heritage always remains locked within our own walls, against which we collide and in which we draw an image of the world. Whether we manage to enlarge them as long as we keep them high, closed, and narrow. In addition to the sentimental relationships of sympathy and hostility, there's a third category, the interested parties, a relationship that seems to deepen its roots, where the man represents his own impression of the world, starting from his most primitive and dark sensuality. In this third type, sentimental impressions still present the components of the other two, undifferentiated as mixed in a strange and paradoxical way. And it is precisely in that paradox where lies the new. Its effectiveness is extraordinary, its fertility, as it produces the feeling as if man is about to enter into the totality of life through himself, and at the same time above himself. And that is the field of erotic relationships. It has often been noted, and rightly so, that the love between the sexes is the eternal struggle, the primal enmity of the sexes. And if this applies to these individual cases, it is clear that in love, two strange parts come together, two opposites, two worlds, between which there are neither bridges that connect us to the known, nor will there ever be. Similar and familiar as when we approach ourselves, we move within our own enclosure, and we approach what is ours. It is not by chance that in the same circumstances, they can give rise to both love and hate, both being genuinely phases of the same storm of passions. It is not coincidental either, and it emanates from the nature of sexual generation, this basis of erotic sensation. What results from it? That this occurs from the union of two cells of protoplasm that are as different as possible, from where the sexual differences derive and are fixed forever in their disparity. Throughout the animal kingdom, it does not encounter that law which in most cases threatens inbreeding with the sterility, degeneration, and extinction, instinctively driving creatures to avoid breeding in their own nest, mating to orient towards strange animals in the species. In love, the push catches us, the shot of anyone else, the mutual attraction, just because something is new, strange, perhaps longed for and dreamed of, gives us the first opportunity and initiative. Something that does not is our known and familiar environment in which we have been immersed for a long time, and that is slipping away from us repeatedly. And that is why the end of a passionate outburst is feared, when two people begin to know each other too well, and the charm of novelty fades away. And that's why also the beginning of a falling in love is defined by the uncertain and trembling light in which it begins, and not only to lend it an ineffable charm, but a mesmerizing force, fruitfully insinuating, that shakes the whole being and leaves the soul in full agitation, that will hardly occur again later. And it is true that in the moment when the loved object acts upon us as something known, familiar, and close, and already as a symbol of possibilities and strange forces of love, then the very act of falling in love comes to an end. It may well be that the lovers, after having revealed themselves to each other in such a dangerous way, they follow a period of mutual inner sympathy, but have nothing in common with the precedent feelings, with its style and colorfulness, and is often characterized by being filled with very small ones, very small charms, despite all its very serious friendship. And moreover, that very thing that once enchanted us in its multiple details can even irritate us instead, leaving us indifferent, as would be the case between two whose initial relationship was one of friendship. And after all of this, the uncomfortable fact is revealed that it was not the homogeneous, the similar, that aroused our eroticism, but rather our nerves trembled at a strange world where we cannot feel at home, like in our own comfortable and solid everyday life. The lover, in terms of love, behaves more like the egoist than like the altruist. It is capricious, demanding. It is tinted by strong selfish desires while lacking that frank and immediate goodwill for which we care for one another, without seeking ourselves in ourselves, and sharing human joys and sorrows. Selfishness reveals itself in love, and already, not with shades of mercy and gentleness, but it sharpens firm and acute, like a fearsome weapon of conquest. But it does not intend that weapon, as we do when we use people and the things, to strip the object of its own purpose, to marvel at its own lordship and fullness, but rather the opposite, plunders it, when it grants value to everything, esteems it, and overvalues it, places it upon a throne, and it is carried on the hand. And for this reason, in erotic love, all the exaggerations are sheltered, both of selfishness as well as goodness. Both have transformed into passion, regardless of the paradox of having been mixed into a single and unique feeling. It is as if something were happening in our inner life, a small tear or crack through which we could tip over like drunks in the whirlwind of life. Its exterior, while at the same time we continue to be marked by the same passionate selfishness. We find ourselves in a position to bond with the loved one through that love that embraces in the other a shared humanity and exalts it to thus remain in the environment of one's own being. We exalt ourselves, on the contrary, in our own singularity and otherness, moving away precisely from what we love. We create for ourselves with extreme vividness the awareness of duality and distinction. But in that understanding and deepening, our own self is outlined and intensified precisely to the extent that we must overflow and revel in the beloved. In him, besieged by him, and mutually expressed, flows like a liberating current our common strength, and saves us productively of ourselves. The lover feels overflowing with strength and transported to another world, as if he had conquered the whole world for the sake of that internal mixture of himself with something that instills in him the inner concept of all possibilities of beauty and all strangeness of the whole world. That feeling, however, is nothing more than the psychic reverse of the physical process in whose ultimate consequences man truly surpasses himself, as he asserts and fulfills himself from the fuller form. In passionate love, the other is mixed and embraced, not to lose oneself, but to surpass oneself, to perpetuate in a new man, in his children. The erotic relationship is therefore an intermediary form between the individual being as such, the selfish one, and of being with social sensitivity, the herd animal, the brother. In the deep and dark essential form of the erotic, both currents that move us in their duality come together in a primitive current. But from this it cannot be derived, as has often been done, that the passionate love with its physical conditioning is precisely an internal way of relating to the whole, harmoning of spirits of people with similar inclinations, and finally, everything with everything. A form that constitutes only a preliminary stage, and always necessary. In reality, the erotic is inherently a world of its own, like the social feeling of community or the selfish individualized man. It goes through all the stages, from the most primitive to the most complicated, within its own scope, and when it delves into the mutations of real life, the enclosure of the other two does not outline and reinforce it, but simply renounces its own. They all have the same primary origin in the general existence of being, and the various worlds, the feelings arise from the circumstance that the sexes yearn for each other in their eroticism. But that common basis has nothing to do with the successive evolution, despite what could be called a blood relation. The impulse that drives the sexes to seek and love each other still remains due to their nature, and remains so in all its phases, something completely different from other relationships among beings. It is explained, however, why a quality that is at its core as paradoxical as the loving sensations are often rated so hesitantly, because suddenly it is undervalued as somewhat selfish, or suddenly overvalued as altruistic, each time depending on which way the balance tilts. An expression of their physical dependence or their emotional exaltation. And therein lies the second paradox, because it is made entirely clear that both physical and spiritual manifestations mix, and they tolerate the most surprising paradoxes. We are accustomed to distinguishing our physical needs and their trends of our spiritual demands, but at the same time, we know how intimate their mutual interdependence, and how inexorably the spiritual processes are as well parallel manifestations of other physical impulses. However, physical impulses do not reveal themselves, nor do they express their demands with the same force to constantly call our attention and claim our consciousness. Through unperception, through that lack of attention, is precisely where it slips through the erotic feeling. It fills us like nothing else could. Our whole soul with illusions and spiritual idealizations that then make us clash brutally against the source of such excitement, against the bodies. We can no longer ignore it, nor divert our gaze from it, and with each open gaze at the essence of the erotic, we simultaneously witness an atavistic and primitive theatricalization, a process of birth of the psychic, with all the pomp of the great and encompassing maternal womb of the physical. Given that we have become accustomed to connecting different meanings under the words corporal and spiritual, just like for the terms selfish and altruistic, we spontaneously see ourselves led to partially understand the phenomenon of love, in order to encompass it under a conception unitary, and hence the surprising dualism in the conception of the erotic, and consequently its representation from two completely antagonistic sides, until finally their extremes, their consequences lead to assertions that are completely contrary to those that must simultaneously be given to them. For there is a reason in the magnificent exaltation of a passion, as in the case of Romeo and Juliet. And there is reason, in its own way, for the criticism expressed by a nervous contemporary poet that in all of this there is nothing more to see than annoying complications of puberty love, the image of the passion expressed by all the men who are touched by it, who, pierced by its wound, go muttering love, and the acknowledgement is also authentic in its bare physiological truth. In the caustic phrase of the French cynic, when he says love is nothing but the rubbing of two epidermises. The abruptness of both contrasts is favored by a special circumstance. Our sexual life has been located in us in its physical aspect and has distanced itself from the other functions. Something like the digestive function has been located in the belly, or the respiratory one in the lungs, but to the difference of these leads to an internal excitement of the whole person that drags the whole being to an extreme passion. Its activity is as central and all-consuming as that of cerebral life, the youngest, late, and tender sprout of evolution, in its intimate spiritual demands. But that force has a more brutal impulse in the bodily apparatus, and much more special in the first flat. And thus, the erotic seems equally to participate with sovereign certainty in both the advantages of the more characteristic differentiation of the spiritual, which always reserves a peculiar space for its function, as of the advantages of an excitation of undifferentiated and unitary forces, which only show few highly organized animal species. And this dual activity successfully imposes itself, in their company perhaps, because it represents that force that first appeared, with the first flashes of nervous energy, of psychic activity, in the life of beings, which not only accompanied them in their ulterior evolution, but has become the paleo womb of being, from which they arise until the end of the world. Even in the love life of animals, the humorous phenomenon occurs of seeing how their burning desire is satisfied on one side in a simple and spontaneous way, just like any other vital necessity, and on the other hand, it determines their sensual world up to sentimental ecstasy or even the passionate hypnosis. In erotic relationships between people, the aspect does not always prevail humorous from the example. They are sometimes taken in such a grossly comedic way that they become objects of what one should be ashamed to talk about, as if it were touching upon the vulgar. Or it is taken from almost tragic form when erotic exaltations appear as deceptive or fatal illusions, obsessions. A dark feeling of that apparent dualistic nature of the phenomenon of love can even occur in the lover, and is perhaps one of the strongest foundations of that shame, instinctive bond that innocent young people feel for each other in their relationship corporal. This additivism of shame does not derive solely or always from the education received, but it emerges spontaneously. They express and felt precisely in love the totality of themselves the same, the totality of their being fully expressed, and the passage of that capture of their totality towards an active implication of a bodily process which lacks the full emphasis of an activity that is what produces confusion. It can have the same effect as when, said in expression in a paradoxical expression, suddenly a third party is present whose participation had not been fully made evident so far. Bodies as such, bodies as part of the person in itself, and it may evoke the impression that deep down they had been closer before, totally close, immediately close, in the unconditional orgy of their soul union. However, that apparent duality in the loving process has its root precisely in the fact that the bodies and also the souls both express their, without reservation, all their paradoxes, and they propel us through their effective involvement in all our movements. What happens there, the union between two people by virtue of erotic attraction, is perhaps not the only one, nor even the most unique union that takes place there, as it is primarily produced in each person precisely because of this, a kind of intoxicating and joyful mutual interoperation of the most sublime productive forces of the body and of the highest spiritual elevation. While outside of it, our awareness of our own corporality seems to us like a quite bad and hardly controllable world, within which a being must move, but that in reality is often poorly tolerated. Suddenly, an innervation occurs and bursts in, commonly felt among those who mutually ignite their desires and longings. Like most married people who often fight, but that does not diminish the undeniable feeling of one's own living union. In the same way, body and spirit suddenly meet before the delight of the link, renewed every hour. Then, the great day of celebration and joy at the sound of trumpets and timbales, with the joy that pulsates even in the tips of the nerves in an endless happiness. And that party is the authentic one. The celebration of the erotic rapture, where the bodies and loving souls feel united in their intimacy. A hug that causes a vital renewal of strength, of all that is healthy, like in a miraculous bath. And not without reason is it said that all love brings joy, even to the most unfortunate. The certainty of that proverb must be understood without any sentimentality, without any reference to the other lover, simply like the joy of love itself, which, in its jubilant animation, ignites thousands of lights, even in the most remote corner of our being, with a glow that illuminates all things outside. And for that reason, it may happen that people of a certain spiritual strength and depth of soul know all the essentials of love, even before having loved. And like poor Emily Bronte, from that Maeterlinck speaks in his last book with too much admiration, were capable of reflecting the happiness of love with suggestive fervor and vehemence. What is received in the loving experience, in the real life through love and the possession of the other, is a special kind of happiness, happiness through unfolding, like in the echoes of the scream, with surprise and joy at seeing that things in the exteriors reproduce our shout of joy. And to that same extent, we become more receptive and discoverers when saying goodbye and receiving back all the tenderness and hidden depths of our soul, all that wealth of enthusiasm, which are certainly illusions and love blindness in relation to pure possession, the personnel of the other, but that have their reality and truth, as they are an expression of our mute emotion, hearts that have been provoked for this reason, which is not limited only to adornments and splendors and holidays. Even when we sigh to feel filled by the other, it is only us who, from our own position, and on the contrary, we feel capable of taking care of ourselves, intoxicated with the possession of something, whatever it may be. Romantic passion is rooted in the conditions of a real and objective assumption of the other, of their entrance into us, but even more so, our deepest entry into ourselves, in our multifaceted solitude, but in a way as if we were replacing thousands around of mirrors that reproduce our loneliness to the point of seeming to encompass and envelope the whole world. The beloved object, however, is only there the occasion that provides access to everything. Something like a bothersome dream is enclosed in a smell, or a noise that disturbs our sleep and leads us to dream. And this is how any type of spiritual and creative activity can be influenced by the erotic occasion, already at the same time feeling elevated and almost electrified, even in areas that by their appearance seem practical or abstract moves away from the personal. Above all, they can be heightened, those activities that are mostly differentiated and mostly dispersed, thanks to that force of push that provides them heat and burning. Then certain combinations flash, are formed and colored, certain images that were previously dead, because all creative activity has its antecedents, no longer in a clearly developed mood state, but in the ability to connect from that clear development quota and in a powerful link with all the life that yearns and squeezes within us. That in we speak and whisper to its deepest root, and from there emanates its generative force. From there it blooms always, something that by being a living whole can live with its own strength alongside its creator, something that is at the same time its work but independent, just like the process that is revived constantly in physical life when the maturity of the body leads to reproduction. By sinking into that depth of life, our spirit often reveals, thanks to all erotic, some powers that I did not possess before, at the expense of others that I had possessed until then. And there in that introspection, it sometimes seems as if the person at a precise moment adopts the expression of a spectator, whose lips could express more than he could have to suspect by the profile of his face. However, when bringing order and reflection to the events of the day, and especially with regard to the loved object, which never knows how to fully adapt to the context, the expression, the face may be that of a smiling and surprised child, and it may be that all of that is already in him. More than anything else, focused on a fruitful core that cannot unfold in partial activities. And then it resembles a child, and in fact, it has become a child in its atavistic balance between body and soul, and the naive awareness of both. A child who takes everything seriously, to whom everything is new, who, full of faith and limitless confidence, would like to peek into the world unsuspectingly magnificent. And its only inclination towards wise reason is its most beautiful somersault. As amazing as it may seem, there are fine and subtle traits of being that connect to being, genuinely beloved. From the bottom of my heart, with the constant praised childhood of nature as brilliantly creative, well, the lover touches in a transitory moment caused by the physical, and from there through another path, that depth where those exceptional men delve, and he knows, as babbling in dreams, to tell something of the delights that are down there, but alas, has forgotten many useful and necessary things. That spontaneous childishness that even the most serious and inveterate pedant can achieve through erotic rejuvenation distinctly, insubordinately, the truly erotic aspect of that kind of simple, lewd greed, whether it be more or less refined. As in the case, the bodily excitement is always isolated, partial, and does not affect the characteristic nature of rapture of man as a whole. from the awareness of not being an object of objective appreciation for one another, as could be, it will be the other things, but simply and plainly, an original fable is where the attitude of the lovers take on their distinctive imprint during the early stages of their relationship. It's as if each one they would dress up for the other with the image and posture of a benevolent idealization, which they strive to maintain. It would be unfair to confuse this with any type of impact or staging of simple vanity. It arises more as a derivation of one's own loving feeling, seriously taken as if it couldn't be avoided, creating another environment simply by appearance instead of the real and daily things, another different level of everyday life, all that which provides for the lover a special atmosphere, a singular brightness. It is not fully authentic nor accessible from the point of view of everyday life, but it is subject to a serious yearning for beauty, to which man is delivery with much more modesty than ever, with more boldness than ever, in search of a link of beings completely new. Certain things can only be experienced, so to speak, in a stylized, not realistic way. For to live in its full sense, perhaps because its enormous poetic fullness can only be grasped, keeping them that way. The reception door, through which love grants us entry, opens into its peculiarly decorated building in a way different from any other door, whether the largest friendship and the appreciation of values. And there is no other entrance, and it is quite possible that there isn't then another path, because we do not move there in a world of reality, and we are only the space and the exciter of that powerful and unrestrained world of dreams. The love between two people will go as far as they are willing to give it together, possibility. And that dimension, whatever its vital scope, is outlined by concentrating and unfolding on its own in its creativity in a manner analogous to how it can occur in the physical act of love among bodies. What acts internally within them cannot be rationally exposed, nor can it be based on the conception of the common elements of its being, as it could root in traits more central, more hidden, and darker than what appears in consciousness. Just as two bodies never unite in their entirety, but rather in relation to one another, specific aspects in their sexual relationship, it also happens there as if two surfaces of two beings do not. They will couple in their entirety, but only at a deep point of stimulus that arises in them, all their creativity. To appreciate a relationship in which we owe that feeling of unity, not the assessment properly according to the strength or lack of everything that factually unifies us with the other, but rather we rely as a criterion on real romantic impulses, on the immediate and irresistible propensities of our nerves before the clear evaluations of our awareness and how much it can perceive. The same thing happens in the artistic field as in cases of the creative process, and once again we encounter the analogy of love with artistic creation. Of the things that deeply and brilliantly they stimulate the artist in their creativity, this one only takes certain aspects, certain facets of their motivation, while neglecting, without addressing or exploiting, all the other fullness of motivating force. If a landscape inspires a painting or a poem, the artist will take it as specific occasion, giving it a creative treatment in which everything is subordinate to its idea. Everything that has driven seems to then focus, summarize on the creative moment of its raptured and pleasant overvaluation. In the force of love, in which the artist delves, it seems as if all things external of love will be poetized in him as something deeply known, as if the outside world would mysteriously assume its own form there, or as if it were losing its own being there, population that constitutes the authentic psychic process. Just as we find life more interesting when we lose ourselves in the physical delivery, as well as in that deep and mysterious paradox of all life, the sovereignty of the object, beloved reveals himself to us with all his strength when, just as the artist does with the landscape poetized, since our passion we reveal and capture in a purely subjective way that which arises from our exaltation. In reality, at the same time as we fully immerse ourselves in it, we also take everything from him for ourselves. We just take away what is not necessary to leave, fully of ourselves. Hence, love and creation are fundamentally the same thing. In creation, the living work emerges in the face of the occasion that incites it. Of overflowing love, of the overflowing sensation of well-being, the intimate meaning of a loving action. And for this reason, all love is a creative action, a joy of creation caused by the beloved person, but not because of her, but because of and due to oneself. Therefore, the erotic must undoubtedly be considered for its own being, just like the activity creative of the spirit, as an intermittent state that arises and subsides, and whose intensity or fullness cannot be predicted in any specific case of its probable duration. It can be guaranteed a certain duration in that a greater intensity can extinguish more quickly in certain circumstances. However, like all circumstances that exceed the normal, a strong feeling of love is not in a position to believe in its own end, to form an image of his death, of his passing, and he revels both in the most unabashed security of life and in the most tested fidelity lacking eroticism. All those eruptions of ourselves, whether joys, pains, or passions, lack awareness of time due to their overwhelming force. And precisely because of their expiration, they are wrapped and surrounded by a deep eternity. And only that, the accent of almost mythical hues, is what makes joy so happy and pain so tragic in our fickle nature, in our world.